Now, pretty much pregnancy was something that you didn't really hear in movies or, you know, TV shows and that, but that was like way back in the day when the strict restrictions of production code happened between 1934 and to 1968, which largely prohibited showing visible baby bumps or discussing childbirth in detail, while in the early films from the 1930s to 1950s. So, I mean, they usually use like baggy clothes or hidden stomachs to imply pregnancy, and it became a more direct and visible plot point around 1968. Amplified films like, for example, Rosemary's Baby. Now, the reason why pregnancy was not shown, from the 1930s to the like late 1960s is because it was a very controversial, subject when it came to movies. Because, there is like a lot of key historical eras in movie pregnancy. So, like pre-code era, which was before 1934, pregnancy was occasionally touched upon, but however, it was largely banned from realistic portrayal once strict censorship took over. And the production code era, which took place from 1934 to 1968, pregnancy was treated with intense discretion. Actors were allowed to say baby, but rarely pregnant. Characters like Mary Astor in The Great Lie or Barbara Stanwyck in No Man of Her Own, oversized robes and or coats they used to hide the bulge, which is the baby bump. Now, however, while movies were hesitant, TV pioneered the visible written pregnancy, like Lucille Ball famously forced CBS to allow her real life pregnancy to be written into I Love Lucy. So, I will be talking about I Love Lucy in a separate video because it was actually one of those older shows from, the 1950s. I personally really enjoy that. But sometime around the late 1960s, or the shift, the decline of the production code allowed for more realistic portrayals, like Rosemary's Baby and Funny Girl, are noted for featuring visible central pregnancy storylines. However, sometime in the 1970s and beyond, pregnancy became a standard plot device for comedies, dramas, and horror, allowing for more realistic emotional and sometimes comedic takes on the experiences. So, I mean, there were times where you couldn't say pregnant on TV back then. They aimed to uphold the conservative values and try to avoid topics that were deemed inappropriate for viewers. So, of course, the term pregnant was deemed far too explicit for the everyday American time, but that was way back then in the times. Now, however, that was something that you didn't really understand. Now, when it comes to Disney, you don't usually see pregnant characters like in, Disney or any other, children's film productions. I mean, you might get, idea that a character's pregnant. Like, you might hear the word that they're going to have a baby or something, but you don't usually see that when it comes to movies. Now, I did about something similar to this in pregnancy and TV shows. And I mean, with TV shows, they still kind of show pregnancy here and there, but they're kind of hesitant to put it there because it's a very controversial subject. Like, it was very controversial at the time. Now, the first Disney movie to feature a pregnant woman happens to be Chicha, which happens to be in Emperor's New Groove, is the first pregnant woman ever seen in a Disney animated feature film, and one of the first human mothers who isn't villainized or killed. So it's honestly something that I didn't really know about that at the time, but I really do have to really say is that, of course, there are other classic old Hollywood movies. These, however, there were times where they ended up hiding pregnancy because they obviously, it was censorship at the time and, back then. So, it was a big deal back then. But nowadays, you can hear and see pregnant characters in like movies and even TV shows, and but they had limits too, but they at least didn't try to hide the pregnancy in the character, which I obviously thought that was a real treat because, back when, censorship was really something from 1934 all the way to 1968, you don't usually see characters pregnant or hear about it, but they do their best to, cover it up so that way people won't know if, the character's pregnant or not. But that's just me. But I'm really gonna be honest, was it's still a controversial subject matter. I could definitely say, but soap operas managed to, use pregnancy in their soap operas, with pregnant characters. Like, I'm gonna sit here and just give an example of As the World Turns. Now, As the World Turns did pregnancy, and it became, more of a thing, sometime, I think, in the 1970s, 80s, or 90s. But I know they definitely were open about pregnancy in, the 90s. Because, that's when they started becoming, more popular. Like, the thing is As the World Turns came out in the 1950s. And they didn't really show pregnant characters there's up till the 80s or 90s. But I know they showed pregnancy in characters in the 90s, but I think also in the 80s as well. But even back then, when soap operas were becoming a thing, you don't really see pregnant characters, but when you do, they usually start showing and you do see that they are pregnant and stuff like that. I mean, is it a still controversial subject matter to be used in movies and shows? Well, the answer is it kind of really depends on what they're going to use the pregnancy for in a certain, show or movie. Like, are they going to use it to, show everybody more detail on childbirth from that? Or are they going to, be hesitant on that? But I mean, you know, it is still a controversial subject at times, it but they use but certain movies use that subject matter just to, make a certain plot line to, keep the movie flowing with, everything that they have gotten up into this point when they were, making movies. Now, I definitely do need to sit here and say is pregnancy, you don't usually hear that in, the older films, but nowadays you can hear it without, people, getting, all upset or something or strict about censorship. But, censorship is still something that happens, and it does happen, when it comes to certain media. Like, even in storybooks, you may get, hear that a character's pregnant in storybooks. Like, in books, like, for example, Breaking Dawn, you do get to hear that Bella's pregnant in that one. And, I did a review on that on pregnancy movie reviews, I think last year. So if you guys want to go watch that, you can. But like in media, it's really something on how you can discover media with, lots of stuff that they have in it, like pregnancy. Now, I definitely do need to sit here and say is that when it comes to, kids' films, you don't usually see pregnant characters, but every now and then you do get a pregnant character, which is obviously something that I personally never had a problem with. And, most of the time, it's just something that, people like to do to add to, to the media, just to make it more believable and to keep the story going. Now, I will sit here and say, in I Love Lucy, Lucy Ball is pregnant in that, which is obviously very realistic because Lucy was actually pregnant in, real life pregnant in that in that show, in that era. Not just, the character being pregnant. She was actually pregnant, which is very something that you don't see in, old shows like that, because it's controversial, and it honestly, certain shows and movies can be quite hesitant when it comes to adding pregnancy. But in my opinion, if you look at Dhar videos, there are times where Dhar characters end up being pregnant. Like, you see some pregnant characters in Dhar sometimes in some of their videos. If the video has to do something about the pregnancy and the pregnant character, etc. But you don't usually hear that when it comes to media. But it is a treat when you're into, pregnancy. Like, I mean, there's all sorts of media that is still out there, and, questions are still beyond us that we always want to know what they are, and most times we probably may not get an answer to, but at the same time, you never really know what media questions they're going to have. So it's honestly something when it comes to media that you do hear pregnant or, stuff like that. But, I really didn't like the fact that, back from 1934 to 1968, you really see characters that are pregnant, but they hide the pregnancy, because they just don't want to make it too obvious, because, if they were pretty strict on that back in the time. But I Love Lucy was an exception, and I know a few other shows like As the World Turns was another exception. But like I said, I haven't seen the whole As the World Turns show. I only watched the Carjack era, which happens to be Carly and Jack. For those of you guys who don't know, Carly and Jack are pretty much, a thing that went on in As the World Turns. I think they started doing that in the 1990s, which is one of my favorite eras when it comes to media. Now, I'm just going to sit here and say right now that that's pretty much all I have to really say about media. But like I said, you really don't really know much about what media will do. You don't know what people have planned in store. So it's always a mystery when it comes to, adding subject matters in media, which I find it interesting how they use it in their way. Sometimes they might do stuff to harm the pregnant character, to harm the child, or, both, kill them off, etc. But, you never really know what the pregnancy outcome is going to be on a certain character until much later on. So it's honestly something that you really should take, a grain of salt on this. So I guess with that being said, that's pretty much all I have to really say. But, like, if I'm missing something that you guys, want me to, elaborate or more, you guys can let me know in the comments below. But as always, I'll be seeing you guys all in the next video. Peace out, and like always, I will be seeing you all in the next video. Have a great night, and as always, I'll see you all next time. What's up, my pretties? It's the Lion Queen here. I want to appreciate you all for tuning into this video, and I do appreciate you guys supporting my video by giving this video likes and stuff. If you really enjoyed this video, be sure to leave a like, comment and subscribe if you're new, ring the bell for notifications to when I upload, so that way you guys will get updated for whenever I upload. If you want to follow me on Twitter or DeviantArt, feel free to leave a follow on those if you are interested in following me on those socials. If you want to support my backup channel, known as Ms. Dark Shigo, feel free to subscribe to it, as a link to that will also be in the About page section. And with that being said, and that being the case, thank you so much for watching, my pretties, and as always, stay pretty.